Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to Urban Legends under the historical setting. Island Warfare. On the 15th of August 1943, American forces fighting the Japanese prepared to invade Kiska, a small island in the North Pacific between Alaska and Russia. Japanese forces had invaded the island as well as another nearby, 1 year earlier in order to protect Japanese territory in the area. The United States responded with a serial bombardment and naval blockade, determined to drive the Japanese from the territory, but they stayed put, leaving as the only option an invasion of ground forces to take on the estimated 5,000 Japanese Marines. American and Canadian troops landed en masse on the 15th of August, determined to retake the island, but, in their amazement, nobody was there. Several weeks previously, US forces had retaken the neighbouring island, and the Japanese, intimidated and decided to make a secret retreat from Kiska. They left under cover of night and heavy fog, without anybody noticing. As a result, the Allied forces were tasked with invading an empty island. In the process, they lost more than 100 men and suffered hundreds of casualties after they fired on each other. Booby traps left by the Japanese were triggered, and a destroyer struck an underwater mine. Fascist Forest. In a small rural German town not far from Berlin, which had started to forget the horrors that occurred decades previously, the country's dark past emerged in the early 1990s when a plane flew over to take aerial images. The aircraft went past a heavily wooded area dominated by dark green pine trees, and when the photographer developed the pictures, he was shocked by what he saw. A patch of 100 or so larch trees, with their light yellow autumn leaves, stood out from the green pines. They were laid out in the shape of giant swastika, the revealed symbol of the Nazi Party. Once the image got into the press, speculation went into overdrive. Who had planted these sinister trees, and when? Their size implied that they must have been planted many years ago, at the height of the Nazi regime. If that was true, it meant that the swastika had been appearing in the forest every autumn for more than 50 years before it was noticed. Possible perpetrators range from the Hitler Youth Group to a zealous local Nazi official keen to show his support for the Führer. But the mystery was never solved. The authorities made several attempts to remove the trees, but they always regrew. The next is Nazi bones. Adolf Hitler's suicide in his bunker as the Red Army marched on Berlin has long been the subject of crazy conspiracy theories. Russian officials have done little to dampen speculation about what happened to his body after his death, and they added to the stories when they unveiled what they believed to be concrete evidence of his demise: parts of Hitler's skull and jaw. The gruesome find, complete with bullet hole, had been locked away in a vault since the end of the war, but was displayed proudly in Moscow exhibition to mark the anniversary of the war's end. Russian security services would not say how the bones came to be in their possession, but it's rumoured that they were picked up as macabre trophies by the soldiers of the Soviet army when they invaded Berlin. The Russian officials enjoyed the irony that Adolf Hitler ordered his body to be burnt before burial, precisely so that his remains couldn't be put on display in Moscow. The Titanic. British newspaper editor W.T. Stead had predicted the future. Some years before the Titanic set sail, he wrote a story about a steamer that sank in the Atlantic after colliding with another vessel, causing many casualties. Stead predicted that this is exactly what might take place and will take place if liners are sent to sea short of lifeboats. He also wrote a novel that describes another vessel sinking in the Atlantic. This time the survivors were rescued by an ocean liner of the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic. In 1912, Stead was invited by President Taft to speak in America, where he expected to pick up an award, and booked his passage across the Atlantic aboard the Titanic on a maiden voyage. When disaster ultimately struck, Stead, one of the most famous Englishmen on the boat, is said to have given away his life jacket and helped women and children onto the lifeboats, whose shortage he had predicted many years earlier. Like many others, he survived the sinking but drowned after clinging to a raft for several hours in the frigid water. Others had more luck, or perhaps not. British engineer John Preece survived the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, as well as that of her sister ship, Britannic, in 1916, and that of the ships Alcantara and Donegal during World War One. Violet Jessup, a nurse who had survived the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, also lived through accidents involving two other White Star Line ships, the collision of the Olympic with HMS Hawke in 1911, and the sinking of the Britannic in 1916. There are other curious coincidences surrounding the tragic sinking of the Titanic. Being a luxurious state-of-the-art vessel, she had an early movie theatre on board for the upper-class passengers. As the iceberg hit, the theatre was showing an early silent version of The Poised Adventure, telling the story of an ocean liner supposedly unsinkable, which was lost at sea. The world's nicest pirate is the next one. Not all pirates are murderous rogues who delighted in seeing their prisoners blindfolded and forced to walk the plank. Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, a pirate from Wales, was famous for his discipline and moral fibre. He was a reluctant pirate who only turned to the profession after the slave ship on which he was first mate was captured by another buccaneer. He reportedly said that since he had dipped his hands in muddy water and must be a pirate, it was better being a commander than a common man. He was teetotal and also a devout Christian who refused to fight on Sundays and held services for his crew, complete with band and hymns. Despite capturing vast quantities of rum, beloved by most of his colleagues, he preferred tea, and he enforced a ban on gambling and drinking below decks after 8 p.m. Moreover, he banned fighting between crew members, who weren't even allowed to bring women on board. This didn't stop him being a proper pirate, though, and he pillaged 400 ships of their valuables. In fact, it probably helped. Old Ironsides. The following tale made the rounds online among patriotic Americans, extolling the virtues of U.S. Navy and confirming some of the heroic stereotypes regarding the sailor at war. On the 27th of July, 1798, the USS Constitution, also known as Old Ironsides, because of her tough-fought victories under enemy cannon fire, sailed from Boston on a simple mission to destroy and harass French shipping. She carried 46,800 gallons of fresh water for her crew of 450, an amount that was deemed sufficient to support 6 months of operations and military engagement at sea. According to the ship's log, she also carried 7,400 cannon shot, 11,600 pounds of black powder, and 71,300 gallons of Kentucky whiskey. Research in Jamaica on the 6th of October, she also took on board 400 pounds of saltfish, 800 pounds of flour, and 68,500 gallons of rum. A month later, she arrived in the Dominica, where the quartermaster claimed 500 pounds of beef and 60,000 gallons of local wine. Then she set sail for France. On the way there, she sank 6 French men of war and several cargo ships of the same nationality, salvaging the fine wine they carried aboard. Although her ammunition was exhausted, Old Ironsides made a night raid through the French canals, breaking into a brandy distillery and loading up with 20,000 gallons of cognac in the night. Then she set sail back across the Atlantic. 7 months later, Old Ironsides arrived back in Boston Harbour with no shot, powder, food, brandy, rum, wine, or whiskey, and 46,800 gallons of stagnant water. Now that's what they call sailing the high seas. Jeez. The next one is Baby Bridge. In 19th century Cornwall, times were hard for farmers. But they needed to have large families because of the threat of disease, and also so that someone would work and take over the farm. One farmer and his wife were expecting their sixth child. Although the expectant mother was excited, the farmer knew that the crops had failed and they could barely afford to support the children they already had. The months went by, and when his wife went into labour, he called for the doctor, who understood the situation and owed him a favour. The two had made a deal. Immediately after birth, the doctor would say that the baby needed medical attention and take it from the house, making sure that it would not survive. The death could then be blamed on natural causes. It was a long and painful labour, and the farmer couldn't bear to stay in the house. Finally, his wife gave birth to a healthy boy, and as planned, the doctor removed him from her arms, telling her that the child needed to be seen at the hospital. By the time the farmer had returned, the doctor had already disappeared. He drove out of sight of the farm and dropped the bundle over a bridge into the river, refusing to tell the father what he had done, only saying that the matter had been settled. The wife never found out what happened to her child, but the farmer couldn't live with himself, and one day took his own life by jumping off the same bridge, leaving his family destitute. It's said, if you stop your car on the bridge and turn off your engine, you can hear a baby crying. The next is called You've Been Shanghaied. The Shanghai Tunnels in Portland, Oregon are some of the most haunted spaces in America. They consist of a complex system of interlocking tunnels running underneath Portland Old Town, connecting the basements of many hotels and bars to the waterfront or Willamette River. They were originally built to move goods from the docks to the basement storerooms of these establishments, but this wasn't all they were used for. Enterprising criminals used the tunnels to help fulfill the demand for sailors from ships that stopped on the west coast on their way to Asia. There was a severe shortage of young men on these boats, so ruthless gangsters set up operations which would provide them for ship captains at a price. The process was known as crimping or Shanghaiing, as Shanghai was where many of the victims ended up. Gangs of crimpers would roam the bars of Portland, looking for able-bodied men who had drunk too much, or, if they were pushed for time, anybody they could find on the street. If they weren't blind drunk, they were knocked unconscious or drugged, then dragged into basements and dropped into the tunnels through trapdoors. There, the unfortunate men would be locked up in subterranean cells until they could be hauled through the tunnels to the docks to start their new career. They were sold to boarding masters who paid as little as £50 per head and took a commission for every man they sourced. So the more bodies, the better. Crimpers would forge the signature of the captured men who, once on board, were forced to work for no pay. It was actually illegal to leave a ship before it had reached its destination, so any man escaped to face jail. It's thought that thousands of individuals were shanghaied through the Portland tunnels every year, and it wasn't just men who were at risk. Women were also hauled through the tunnels to be sold into prostitution. They were either kept aboard ships as entertainment for the sailors or sent to foreign cities to work in brothels. One Portland crimper in particular became legendary. Boarding masters knew that Joseph Bunko Kelly would stop at nothing to get them any amount of men they needed. Bunko claimed that he had personally shanghaied more than 2,000 people in a 15-year career that continued until he was imprisoned for murder in 1894. It's said that he once successfully crimped a pair of female prostitutes as sailors for £75 each, after dragging them, cutting their hair and dressing them in men's clothes. Bunko's exploits on another night would go down in history. He was charged with providing 50 men for a British ship bound for China that had docked that day and was leaving the next morning. Bunko was set up for the challenge and instructed his men to scour the bars, hotels and brothels of the city, searching for suitable victims. He was walking past a row of saloons, a regular haunt of his, when he heard rowdy voices coming up from the basement and peering through the doors. Saw a room full of drunken men, half-conscious and groaning. Scattered around them were piles of empty bottles. Bunko soon realised that they were not merely drunk. They had been poisoned. The men who had been drinking all day together had been turfed out of one bar, so they broke into a cellar, which they thought supplied one of the saloons above, and set to work drinking the place dry. In reality, they had found the basement of the mortuary and were guzzling a toxic solution consisting of 90% proof alcohol and formaldehyde, used for embalming corpses. But Bunko Kelly, over the professional, didn't let him get in the way of his business. He sent one of the men to the tunnels to get wagons, started sending the incapacitated men down the docks. The total number varies. According to different accounts, the haul was at least 25. The bodymaster was used to Bunko, providing him with semi-comatose sailors, so he thought nothing of it. As far as he was concerned, the crimp had simply fulfilled another contract. The men were dumped in the hold to wait for them to sober up, and the ship set sail with a skeleton crew. But those men never regained consciousness. When the captain went to check on them the next day, they were all dead. It was said that they all looked remarkably good, given all the embalming fluid they had drunk. The tunnels still exist today, and it's believed that many of the ghosts of Shanghai sailors can be heard groaning down there when ships come into dock. Ew. That's gross, isn't it? They drunk embalming fluid. What the heck? The next is Elma McEr. One Halloween in 1970s, a group of kids were spending the day at a California amusement park. They dared each other to go into the House of Horrors, and they discussed how scary it would be to spend the night there. So they hid away and waited until the park closed. They locked around that spooky attraction and eventually fell asleep. One of the kids woke up, realised that he was on his own, and stumbled around the labyrinth, trying to find his friends and pretending he wasn't scared. Soon he bumped into a body, wrapped up like a mummy, which was hanging above him. His stifled scream alerted one of his mates, who crept up behind him and shoved him towards the corpse. The rope holding the figure broke, and it fell on the boy, knocking him to the floor. One of its arms came loose. To their horror, the boys realised that it was not a prop, but a real human body, made of real bone and rotten flesh, and in their panic, they tore around the attraction in the dark, trying to find the exit. When they got back into town, they informed the local sheriff, who didn't believe a word of it, but decided to pay a visit to the attraction the next day to check out the mummy. When he unwrapped the bandages, he was surprised to see that the face was that of a real dead person, with skin stretched across the bone like old paper and several teeth still in the skull. This truly was a house of horrors. The operator was immediately subjected as a perpetrator of some grisly crime, but he was mortified, swearing that he knew nothing about the dead body. He had bought it from a touring sideshow operator who had jokingly told him that it was real, but he didn't think for 1 minute that he'd been serious. The autopsy revealed that surprisingly well-preserved body it was. It was that of a man who had died of bullet wounds at the beginning of the 20th century. Further investigations revealed his identity as an outlaw, Elma McEr, who died in 1911 in a shootout with the sheriff after a train robbery went wrong. His last words were the immortal, "You'll never take me alive." After his death, however, he was taken to a great many places. A mortician embalmed his body after nobody claimed it for burial and put the preserved cadaver on display as a demonstration of his abilities. Elmer's corpse turned into a sort of tourist attraction and became something of a hero as the bandit who never gave up. Elmer was eventually released to a man who had pretended to be his long-lost brother, who had supposedly wanted to give him a proper burial. In reality, he was a slideshow agent, and from then on, Elmer started a long career in show business. For more than 50 years, his body was displayed at travelling circuses and sideshows. Bought and sold a number of times, it was even said that one fairground operator declined to buy him because he wasn't realistic enough. After the kids discovered him hanging in the haunted house, he was finally laid to rest for good. Concrete was poured over his coffin to ensure that he would not be making any more public appearances. Elmer's career as a corpse had been far more successful than anything he ever did while he was alive. Imagine that. The tribes of the shrunken heads. Oh, I like this one, if it's the same one. Ever since explorers first ventured to the jungles of South America and brought back tales of cannibals and headhunters, one legend has remained vividly terrifying. The story of tribes that specialise in shrinking human heads. Western adventurers even brought back what they claimed to be genuine heads that had been shrunk to the size of a doll's. Nobody really believed it. They assumed that they were fakes or the heads of monkeys, mocked to look like humans. They were wrong. The practice was widespread and may have carried on well into the 20th century. The traditional experts at creating shrunken heads, or they are called Santasa or Tantas, Sant Sas also. There's a few different ways of pronouncing it, I believe. They are known were the Jivaro tribe of Ecuador and Peru. The Jivaro people decapitated their enemies and kept their heads as war trophies, shrinking them to the size of an apple, apparently so that their spirits could not reach their afterlife or seek revenge on their killers. They didn't just stop at the heads. The Jivaros also killed a Spanish explorer and shrunk his entire body to the height of 3 feet. Foreigners started to buy shrunken heads from the Jivaro in the 18th century, and this sudden demand kick-started a grisly trade whereby people were killed purely to satisfy the market. The common consensus is that head shrinking died out early in the 20th century as the countries modernised. However, a recently discovered film made by Polish filmmakers in the 1960s captured the gruesome process in detail. It shows Jijavaro taking a freshly severed head, slicing the scalp in order to scrape off the skin and hair, yet keeping the face in one piece. This is then boiled in a special mix of plants and bark that contain tannins, like tea, which help tighten, toughen, and preserve the skin. A similar process to the tanning on leather. Any flesh and fat is discarded, and the grisly mask is sewn back together, with the eyelids and mouth sealed, and the head filled with hot rocks and sand. Finally, the head is dried over a fire for around a week to complete the gruesome process. If the videotape is authentic proof that the Gioro were shrinking heads as late as the 1960s, who's to say they aren't still doing it? Yeah, the shrinking heads legend. It's an interesting one, that, isn't it? What do you think, guys? U-boat alert is the next. In early 2016, online news sites reported that a World War II Nazi submarine had been discovered in Lake Ontario. The submarine was first noticed by amateur divers a couple of months earlier, although they couldn't tell exactly what it was, as it lay half buried in the sand on the lake bed. They assumed it was shipwrecked, and probably an old tourist steamboat, but they couldn't find any mention of it in guidebooks, so they contacted the authorities. Boats equipped with high-tech sonar imaging equipment were dispatched to the site and revealed its submarine-like shape, so divers from the Coast Guard were sent down to confirm the findings. The divers descended into the depths of the lake and attached buoyancy tanks to float the mysterious vessel to the surface, where markings, still clearly visible on the hull, revealed the sinister Nazi connections. But what on earth was it doing in Lake Ontario? Although there had never been any reports of German submarines making it far inland. German U-boats were known to patrol the Canadian coast during World War II, and they had sunk several ships off the coast of Newfoundland, including a passenger ferry with more than 100 civilians aboard. A few years previously, in 2012, local divers in the nearby Churchill River had also discovered what they suspected was a German submarine, but that vessel's never been formally identified or recovered. Suddenly, the intelligence services took an interest. If the two stories were true, there had been a serious lapse in national security. Experts who examined the craft confirmed that it showed all the signs of being a genuine Nazi U-boat. European officials explained that the boat was an experimental prototype designed specifically to voyage inland, and that it had been deemed lost off the coast of Canada. They surmised that it had travelled up to St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes, where for some reason it had been unable to complete its mission, to cause panic amongst the thousands of tourists who travelled to the lake in the summer. If a U-boat could penetrate that far into North America undetected, who knew where they might pop up next? The idea would have struck terror in the hearts of the American public. The recovered U-boat is to be restored and put on display at the local museum. Experts said that roughly, maybe, although I don't get that bit, let's skip that bit because it doesn't make sense. Experts believe although the vessel has suffered a great deal of corrosion over the decades and become home to many different fish, it nonetheless fared better at the bottom of the lake than it would have done in a saltwater environment. Sometimes this, when you're reading these, there's spelling mistakes in them and stuff, and you have to sort of work around them. The next one's called Lincoln and Kennedy. Only 4 presidents of the United States have been murdered while in office, but that's not all the 2 most famous victims, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, have in common. The former was elected to Congress in 1846 and the latter exactly 100 years later. Lincoln was elected president in 1860 and Kennedy 100 years later. Both men were fathers who lost one of their children while serving as president, and both were involved in the civil rights movement. Lincoln's secretary was named Kennedy, and vice versa. When it comes to their assassinations, both were shot in the head on a Friday, with their wives present. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln car made by Ford, and Lincoln was shot in Ford's theatre. John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Lincoln, and Lee Harvey Oswald, Kennedy's murderer, were born roughly 100 years apart. Both killers had 3 names, composed of 15 characters, and both men were themselves assassinated before trial. Oswald shot Kennedy from a book warehouse and escaped into the theatre, whereas Booth shot Lincoln in a theatre and ran to a warehouse. Both Kennedy and Lincoln's successors were Southerners, named Johnson. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was born in 1808, and Lyndon B. Johnson, who succeeded JFK, and was born in 1908. Wow, that's a lot of frigging coincidences, isn't it? Let's be honest, guys. That's too many coincidences as far as I'm concerned. Geesh. The next is Big Liz. In Maryland, there is a swamp surrounded by a beautiful landscape with a dark secret. Many years ago, the area was covered in plantations worked by slaves. During the Civil War, it was rumoured after the losing Confederate army stashed treasure on the plantations around, Chesapeake Bay? It was said that the Union Army recruited slaves who worked in these plantations to feed them information on the enemy and hopefully lead them to the riches that the landowners were hoarding. Elizabeth was a slave who belonged to a Maryland plantation owner with a particularly murky background, as he was rumoured to use his slaves to smuggle money and arms to the Confederate troops in the region. Elizabeth was a favourite of his because of her sharp mind and loyalty, and he called her Big Liz because of her small stature. As the war wore on and the Union troops marched even closer to his land, her master became worried that he would lose everything, so he enlisted Big Liz to help him bury his gold in the swamp, where nobody would think to look for it. They set off under the cover of darkness with torches, and Liz dutifully dug a deep hole for the treasure under a tree. As soon as she had finished, the slave owner knocked her unconscious and drowned her, so that only he knew where his treasure was hidden. But he never emerged from the swampland, and some years later his pocket watch was found in the belly of a captured alligator. When the Union Army came through and burned the master's house, they reported strange lights floating through the swamp, and one soldier wrote home describing the disturbing things he had seen. When government agents travelled in the plantation of the war looking for the treasure, a woman appeared as if out of nowhere and told them to follow her, as she knew where they could find it. They never returned. Big Liz still appears to people who come looking for the treasure, and some say that if you overcome your fear and follow her through the marshes, she will lead you straight to the tree. But nobody ever follows, and most just disappear. The next is called Tommyknockers. It was 1915, and Arthur was deep in the trenches of northern France during World War One. He was part of a specialist group of troops, all ex-coal miners, whose job it is to dig under the battlefield. The plan was to burrow tunnels under the German trenches, plant explosives and then retreat before the enemy knew they were there. Arthur was an expert and knew exactly how thick the walls of a tunnel should be so that the Germans wouldn't hear them. One day he was chiseling away at the surfaces when he heard a knocking coming from the other side. He whispered back down the tunnel to see if his mates were responsible for the strange noise, but there was no reply. Then the knocking came again. He hammered at the wall to see if there was a response, but there was silence. When he clambered back up into the trenches, he told his colleagues what he'd heard. Most of them thought it must have been the Germans digging their own tunnels. They had probably heard Arthur and were just as scared as he was. But one of the miners, an old man from Wales, whose breathing had become too laboured for him to go down in the tunnels for long, said when he was mining back home, people used to tell stories about strange noises and voices they heard underground. Some blamed it on the lack of oxygen, driving people crazy, but he had once heard them himself. They were called the Tommyknockers because of the way they would knock on the mines, either to warn of an impending collapse or to bring down tunnels themselves, depending on how the story was told. Arthur laughed, told him to keep his nonsense to himself, and went back down the tunnel to continue digging. Soon he was left on his own again, and could tell that he was getting close to German trenches. He was sure that he could hear voices, but couldn't make out what language was being spoken, so he stopped digging to listen. Then came the knocking again, right where he was listening at the wall. He lay perfectly still. He heard a voice saying in English what sounded like, "Tommy, Tommy," followed by more knocking sounds. He felt a breeze across his face, which carried a voice from beyond the wall, and very clear this time he heard, "Get out." He didn't waste any time in dragging himself backwards through the tunnel, fully aware of the terrible thud of soil falling behind him. He was just about to make it back into the main trench when the earth collapsed around him. He couldn't tell whether he was alive or dead, but the next thing he felt was someone tugging at his feet. He was pulled out into the trench, spitting mud out of his mouth, and saw the face of an old Welsh miner, who shook his head and asked him if he still thought he was full of nonsense. The German trenches had completely collapsed, causing the loss of thousands of enemy troops. And those are all those types of urban legend under that category. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.